As world leaders gather in New York for the UN General Assembly, we will take a look at the development goals and sustainability. Hi everyone, I'm Sean Caleb sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. What are governments and businesses doing to protect the world's biodiversity? And how important will it be to preserve all forms of life? We will hear later in our program from the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, Astrid Schomaker. But first, my colleague Elaine Reyes sat down with Achim Steiner, the administrator of the United Nations Development Program. As the deadline for Sustainable Development Goals approaches, they talked about the efforts to fulfill these objectives.
Administrator Steiner, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
The Summit of the Future highlighted the importance of future generations. How is UNDP engaging with young people, and how do you see them shaping the global development agenda?
Well, first of all, let us celebrate a moment in which truly the world actually agreed that there are many things on which we first of all have consensus will matter to the future of the world, of people and development, but also where countries recognize that they must work with one another despite their differences sometimes. And I think some people might say, is the Summit of the Future document, the pact, so to speak, ambitious enough? I don't think at this moment ambition is necessarily the best yardstick. It's to actually more pragmatically look at, can we still agree on the essential things that we cannot solve on our own, and that through multilateralism, through the United Nations, countries can actually agree to cooperate on. Not only in general terms on peace and security or on the development agenda, which remains a central way in which to address these issues, but also on something like the new technologies, digital and artificial intelligence. Part of the outcome of the summit is a digital global compact. The first time that the world has really turned to the United Nations, said we need this platform in order to be able to advance on both the opportunities and possibilities, but also to manage the risks. And I think this is very significant.
The Pact for the Future covers so many different things. But you mentioned multilateralism. The Secretary General called for more effective and inclusive multilateralism, bringing it back from the brink. What happened to multilateralism, and what did he mean by that statement?
You see, multilateralism at the end of the day is both a vision of how countries should come together and work together to solve problems, to prevent wars, to address the great challenges of development, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda. All these are expressions of a collective understanding of where we need to act and commitments by countries to work together. We have seen in recent years an extraordinary amount of conflict re-emerge, polarization in international relations, geopolitical tensions, COVID, financial crisis, and in part this is also UNDP's daily bread and butter. We are working in 170 countries at this moment, trying to help countries to cope with these extraordinary challenges, whether they are sometimes climate change driven extreme weather events, whether it is the high level of debt through the interest rates and the inflation, so to speak, that has driven the cost of capital, leading in some countries literally to a default situation. All this is taking us backwards in development terms, and our role as UNDP, but also the larger United Nations, is to help countries to quickly course correct, find ways in which together we can invest in a way forward, and also to leverage new opportunities. If, for instance, the new technologies are simply in the hands of a few, we know that they will transform every aspect of our lives, economic, social, but also new opportunities for people to earn a livelihood, to have new jobs. If we cannot ensure that these are available everywhere and to everyone, we will have a world with far greater inequality in the very near future. So the Secretary General is in part also speaking to the fact that multilateralism has been neglected. It has not evolved. It was, in a sense, a product of the post-Second World War period. Institutions such as the Security Council, who is a member, who has a veto, all this needs to, in a sense, arrive in the in the present, and even more important, to be reformed for the future. And that includes, by the way, our international financial architecture, because finance remains the lifeblood of economies, but also of the ability to progress.
You mentioned some of the many crises around the globe, conflict, extreme weather, that has set back the Sustainable Development Goals in the last couple of years. I want to read a number. Right now, only 17% of the goals are on track. So we're less than 6 years away. How is UNDP trying to ramp up the last 5 years to meet and reach those 2030 goals?
Let me give you 2 or 3 examples. First of all, every country has its unique circumstances, challenges, and opportunities. When we aggregate these numbers, sometimes, 17% really does sound very sobering. But what it masks is there is a great deal of variation between countries and between the different goals. I give you one example. 1995, only 15, 16 million people had access to the internet. That's only about 29 years ago. Fast forward to today and perhaps to next year, 6 billion people will have access to internet and broadband. And that is more people than were alive in 1995 on planet Earth. So we have seen a phenomenal example of how technology can be disseminated, how it can become a tool to drive development in so many different spheres. Life expectancy has improved. We've seen through COVID also a remarkable set of rapid policy responses, social safety nets, temporary basic incomes, trying to create a health system that could withstand this onslaught that so many countries had to live through. We have learned a lot of lessons. What we are faced with, however, right now, and this is where UNDP is focusing on, how do we ensure that this resilience is not lost? And particularly to look forward, we are helping over 86 countries right now to undertake integrated national financing frameworks. It's a way of looking at, in a fiscally and financially constrained moment, what is the optimal investment strategy, together with domestic and international partners, to invest into the future. We are also helping countries to prepare their new nationally determined contributions, as they're called, under the Climate Convention. Essentially national climate strategies and commitments that need to, at COP30 in Brazil in 2025, the year 2025, help the world believe that the Paris Agreement can still keep us within 1.5 degrees. And here are examples of how in 120 countries right now, UNDP is helping national authorities, the public, different sectors in the economy to look at what are our risks, what are our opportunities, and how do we ensure that these are just transitions. And finally, how do we mobilize the finance behind this? We need to decarbonize our economies in the shortest period of time. Some countries have the ability to do that. China is a remarkable investor in clean technology, not only for energy, electricity, but actually for transport and mobility now. Many other countries don't have those resources. We need to co-invest with them, otherwise we will not be able to succeed. So UNDP's current work is literally in well over 100 countries around the world to address 2 key transition and transformational challenges. On the one hand, the finance constraint. On the other hand, the ability to deal with a green transition, so to speak, in our economies.
I know financing has been the main issue the last couple of years. So going just ahead to COP29, just around the corner, can you tell us a little bit about the Climate Promise 25?
Certainly. The Climate Promise 2025 builds, in a sense, on the experience that UNDP already led in the lead up to the Glasgow conference of the parties some years back, when we took a decision to say we need to help countries to develop their own national climate strategies rooted in their national development realities, their priorities, but also with the level of ambition that is owned by citizens, by the nation as such. And we offered technical support, and we helped over 100 countries at the time to arrive in Glasgow with their own NDCs and a higher level of ambition. In fact, the difference between the Paris moment of NDCs and then Glasgow is probably somewhere between 1/2 to 3/4 of a degree less of global warming. So we could see that the level of ambition was growing, and there has been significant progress. The challenge, however, remains, and this is why this is so important now in the lead up to the year 2025 and COP30. We are still far behind where science tells us we need to be. And the remarkable thing is the world in terms of daily reality, is already showing us the extraordinary price we will pay for not acting. Whether it is China today, whether it is Brazil yesterday, whether it is maybe the United States with forest fires today, Central Europe with floods, parts of Africa with historical droughts, extreme weather events are not only killing people, they're destroying years of development. We need to act faster. And this is why it is so important that countries arrive at COP30 with the confidence that they can implement, and with also a level of ambition where they say, and with additional financing from our partners, we can achieve even more. And that remains the challenge over the next, 14 months, yeah.
And everyone's coming together as we speak. As we're sitting here, we're seeing storms come through. South America is on fire. I know you're from Brazil. Much of that country is suffering from a huge drought. Is that going to be top of mind as well? I mean, everyone is experiencing, no matter where they are in the world, something is impacting their life from climate.
You know, the city that I, in part, grew up in the south of Brazil, Porto Alegre, was, almost entirely flooded earlier this year. I mean, it's a catastrophic situation. But also UNDP last year with the Secretary General in January helped to convene an international donors conference to assist Pakistan that for the second time in just over a decade had a quarter to a third of its national territory completely submerged in floods. It is to me sometimes difficult to comprehend how anybody would, in a sense, argue today that we don't need to speed up actions, because the cost of inaction is phenomenal. In fact, it is unfinanceable. It is inconceivable in many ways if we were to think of a world that is 2.53 degrees locked into global warming. So I think everybody today needs to ask themselves, how can we watch these images? And they're not always on the other side of the world. They're down the street, they're across the border of our country, or sometimes they are my house, my community. These are not things that we can simply say, well, let's wait, we have other problems, we don't want to pay more price for the petrol that we use at the petrol pump. We need a fair and just transition, but we need it fast. And I think every country needs to take action here. And let me here particularly comment on something that I still think is remarkable in many of the initiatives that China has taken when it comes to decarbonization. China has set itself a carbon peak trajectory somewhere before the end of this decade. It may be coming closer to that much earlier, but this year already, maybe close to half, i.e. every second car bought new in China could be an electric vehicle. Now, isn't that remarkable in one of the largest transport markets in the world? The transitions are possible. We have economies across the world today producing 80–90% of their electricity with renewables. It's doable. And some of them are fossil fuel producing countries. Some of them are not. And I spent 10 years in Kenya. Kenya is another example of an African nation that embraced the challenge of renewable energy, had, in a sense, the benefit of geothermal power, and has now invested in wind and soon solar as the backbone of its 21st century electricity. So the opportunity to act is there. But it is remarkable how many people still want to hold on to the economy of yesterday, maybe because it's paying them well, but it's actually ruining the next generation.
Given China's growing influence as a development partner, how does UNDP collaborate with China to advance sustainable development goals?
Well, UNDP and China will this coming year celebrate their 45th anniversary of a partnership that I think has been remarkable in so many ways. When China first opened up, it invited UNDP as one of the first international partners to join in its rethinking of development pathways, choices, trajectories, strategies. I think over 4 decades later, this partnership has delivered many remarkable outcomes, successes, and increasingly also a joint way of learning and creating. We draw very often today on China's approaches to addressing issues of poverty eradication, green transitions, in ways that inform also our work in many other parts of the world. Because at the end of the day, UNDP, with its programs in 170 countries, is a connector. It's a connector of best practice, of technologies, and also of policies that work. And I would say China and UNDP have much to be proud of in terms of looking back. And I hope, in the way that we look at the future, to also see China recognize UNDP as a vital partner to developing countries that are still having to go a certain distance before they are able to say, well, we have broken out of the challenges of extreme poverty, lack of infrastructure, or indeed, for so many countries on the African continent, still the majority of their citizens have no access to electricity, and this is the year 2024.
No doubt this is the busiest week for the United Nations with everyone in New York, and so many serious topics are being discussed, yet you're still smiling. Do you have a sense of optimism? I mean, what is your sense of talking to different world leaders, everyone you've met? The world seems pretty dire, but what sort of insight can you share with us?
It's a very good question, because it is actually a distressing moment, particularly for somebody, together with my many colleagues, who works in the field of development, because what we're seeing right now is a world disrupted, in distress, in conflict with each other, going to war. We are seeing a level of destruction of development, whether in physical assets or in development progress or just in lives lost. That is phenomenal, and certainly is one of the worst years since the Second World War in terms of number of people displaced who have become refugees, the economic setbacks after COVID. But let me also say, before the Summit of the Future, UNDP, together with the International Telecommunications Union and the Secretary General Special Envoy, we organized one of the action days on SDG Digital, as we called it. And just sitting in that room and having invited young people, CEOs, ministers, leaders, scientists, to come together and tell us what it is that they are doing and what is possible with this new frontier of technology, you could not help but smile for a moment, because what I often say is development, the idea of cooperating on development, is actually all about hope, because the future holds possibilities. And in all the misery and all the suffering that is in some ways human created right now, we actually live in an age of possibilities. I mean, there are things that we can imagine doing in the next 10 years, 15 years, that would have been unimaginable, whether it is in terms of digital and AI, whether it is in terms of human health, whether it is in terms of securing the world with a supply of energy that no longer requires you to worry about energy security in terms of somebody else having your energy source. Renewable energy will power the world economy by the middle of this century in most parts of the world. It is a breakthrough that would have been unthinkable maybe 10, 15 years ago. On AI, to give you just a very practical example, people are still falling into poverty because there is no health safety net for them. When your mother, your father, your daughter, your son fall ill in many developing countries, you have nothing to fall back on but your own savings in order to go to a doctor and get the treatment they need. 40% of households who escape poverty and then fall back into it again do so because of these health crises in their family. Now here we have the opportunity, and UNDP is working in partnership with some of the leading insurance companies in the world, to leverage artificial intelligence and the actuarial science, as it is called, the way you price risk in order to have a health insurance, and bring down the cost of health insurance massively, suddenly creating the opportunity for millions and millions of people to have health insurance to prevent precisely this disaster that is not only a health disaster, but then becomes a poverty trap again for people. So these are two very different ends of the equation when I say we live in an age of possibility, that despite what we are, in a sense, causing to ourselves as humanity right now, can give us also reasons to be hopeful about the future.
Administrator Achim Steiner, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
My colleague Jim Spellman spoke with the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, Astrid Schomaker. They discussed how people and business can help save nature.
So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Why is preserving biodiversity so important, and how does it fit into one of the key themes of the UN General Assembly this year, which is sustainable development?
Well, I think preserving biodiversity is at the core of sustainable development. It is basically nature and the biodiversity that underpins our economies, that underpins our health and well-being, that provides sustenance and food for people. So if our biodiversity is not protected and continues to be in decline, we can't rely on the ecosystem services it provides. Our economy's health and our populations, our well-being, and the SDGs will be in trouble.
At the COP15 gathering on biodiversity nearly 2 years ago in Montreal, a huge commitment was made, including pledges to preserve 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030. There was a tremendous sense of optimism leaving Montreal. How are countries doing on meeting those commitments? And what are your goals looking forward to COP16 on biodiversity in Colombia?
Yeah, so 30 by 30 is probably the most iconic of the targets that was agreed in Montreal, and progress is underway. So we're happy that in COP16 we will be able to look at the first national implementation plans, see how these are coming along, and also at the targets that countries have put in place in order to see whether national policies are attuned to the global targets that have been set. Then at COP16 going forward, beyond that we will look at some of the unfinished business from COP15. That includes in particular a mechanism on digital sequencing information for the use of this digital sequencing information from genetic resources. Sounds very technical, but it's really about companies using information from nature, building their business models on it, but not giving back to nature. And we've agreed at COP15 that there should be a mechanism to give back to those countries that harbor the nature. Now we need to make that operational. That's a very important step.
To meet these commitments will require a lot of money. How are countries doing on meeting their commitments in funding and on reducing harmful financial subsidies?
Yeah, there were a number of important commitments made, and you mentioned a very important one, which is reducing harmful subsidies by 500 billion per year. So we don't have a clear amount of figures yet. We know these are parts of the targets that are being put in place. On the positive biodiversity financing, we see an upward trend, but it's really not good enough yet. So we have set in place a specific fund, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, hosted by the Global Environment Facility. Countries have started paying into it, but I think not to the level that was expected. China has set up the Kunming Biodiversity Fund. It's been capitalized by China with $200 million so far over 10 years. We have the new fund that will come with the DSI if we manage to agree on the digital sequencing information mechanism operationalization. So there's money coming, the system trend is positive, but we need to accelerate.
These financial commitments, you talked about the fund set up by China, other mechanisms. Just tell me more about how important it is to have funding mechanisms and for countries to follow through on actually coming up with the money.
Well, it's incredibly important, but there are the funds that are being set up. There's also domestic resource mobilization. Then there are a lot of countries working with UNDP on something called BioFin to have national financing plans. So that is key. But probably one of the most important things is to address the negative spending, because the negative spending, so biodiversity, harmful subsidies vastly outnumber the positive spending. So those commitments that were made in Montreal to cut down harmful subsidies by 500 billion per year, that's what we need to focus on going forward.
Give me an example of a harmful subsidy so people understand what you're talking about.
Well, those would be subsidies that support business models that are maybe too water intensive, that pollute the environment, that have maybe agricultural practices that are using too many fertilizers, too many pesticides, etc. So there are always ways of repurposing them so these businesses don't have to go out of business, but they can do better and they can be nature positive.
So we're here at the UN, of course, the most important global multilateral body. I want to read you a quote from yourself. The UN can only be a facilitator. The real power and the responsibility to make decisions clearly lies with the states. So how do you motivate the states to make those decisions, follow through, and also perhaps what is the role of the private sector in all that?
I mean, only a facilitator. Facilitation is super important, especially I think at this point in time. We need to bring countries together, and the Summit of the Future has just demonstrated that the UN can still bring countries together, so that's very positive. We provide the space for discussion, we provide the scientific information, we work with media such as yourself to get the information out there. We do work with the business sector, and we see more and more business wanting to come to our COP, for example, COP16, biggest business participation ever, and we want businesses to work with us and to understand that yes, they need to be concerned about their carbon emissions, but that's only being part of their global stewardship. They also need to look at their biodiversity impacts. We need to work with them to provide the ways for them to measure, and we need to work with governments and business to implement Target 15, which is about disclosure of biodiversity impacts. So how do they impact, how do they depend on nature, what are their risks? And finance institutions need to pick up on that when they finance businesses and see, is this actually a sustainable business I'm putting my money in?
biodiversity preservation and all climate issues are by nature multilateral.
Right.
So there are no borders that are known by nature. Do you think the Summit of the Future, the Pact for the Future, will help make it easier going forward to address climate issues?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as I said before, it is this idea that countries, despite all the differences we have at the moment, and all the newspapers are full about the differences, but still countries come together, they want to identify what are the main challenges, and they want to say, well, together we can chart a way forward. And the interesting thing is we talk a lot about the crisis, but we all know that we have the solutions. Our global biodiversity framework is one of those solutions, so countries need to implement. But of course, one country going forward is always difficult. But if they do it together, I think we will succeed. So I remain very optimistic, actually.
Of course, one country that is not part of the biodiversity framework is the United States, the only other country that didn't sign on being the Holy See. What is the impact on your efforts of having the United States not involved in this framework?
So obviously we would love for the United States to join the Biodiversity Convention, but I don't think we can say they're not involved. So the US participates in the negotiations, and they have committed to implementing the targets. In the context of the G7, for example, and the G20, they have said we want to implement every single target of the framework. Yesterday we had a big event on the 30 by 30 target, protecting nature, etc. The US spoke in some detail of its effort, America the Beautiful, and of its efforts to support countries abroad. So they are not part of the club per se, but they're very much aligned with the targets and they're doing their part.
So you've been in this job just since July. Your previous job was the head of green diplomacy and multilateralism for the European Commission. How did that job help prepare you for your current assignment?
Actually, I think very well, because first of all, the word green diplomacy is a new term. And what it indicates is we cannot solve today's environmental crisis just with environment policies. They need to be integrated into diplomacy. And that's, of course, what the UN is all about. And we need to have multilateral solutions. So at the EU, I had the chance to work on all these issues beyond biodiversity, so to look more broadly also at the work of the other conventions, the UN system in general, working with UNEP. And I think that's a good preparation, because even as a biodiversity convention with our broad framework, we will not solve the biodiversity framework. We need to work we need to work together with the other conventions, notably the Climate Convention. And during Climate Week here, that's the talk of town. Everybody says we need to come together more, and I think we're ready for that.
So I want to read you another quote from yourself here. You said in another interview, "We're living in a time where nature is regularly raising its hand and saying, 'Look, I'm here and I'm in trouble,' and then bringing us all sorts of natural disasters." How important is it that we take this threat seriously and really start dealing with the preservation of biodiversity as part of this larger climate crisis?
Well, I think everybody now understands it's incredibly important. And when I say nature raises its head, it's that everybody, whether it's Europe, Africa, Asia, everybody sees these natural disasters more and more. And everybody understands they're not just coming from nothing. It is our own way, our economies, our economic models, our unsustainable consumption and production underpinning it. So putting biodiversity in this broader part of a global crisis of biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, and addressing these in synergistic manner, I think is the key to success. And the interesting thing is here at the Summit of the Future that has been recognized, and it's also been recognized that these are not just nature crises out there, but that these crises make it more difficult, if not impossible, to achieve the SDGs and all the other efforts we have, like living in peace with one another, which is, by the way, why COP16 has also a subject called Peace with Nature, so that we can also highlight the role that nature can play in bringing us together.
Are you optimistic the world can come together and face these challenges?
Yes, of course.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. Stay with us all week for more interviews with global leaders from the 79th session of the UN General Assembly. I'm Sean Calebs here in Washington, D.C.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging